Welcome, dear listener, to a tale of resilience and unexpected turns. Today, we delve into the life of Margaret Fletcher, a seemingly frail widow whose world has been turned upside down. What would you do if, after years of hard work and sacrifice, you suddenly found yourself without a penny to your name? This is the question Margaret faces as she drops a bombshell on her children. They never saw it coming. But the real surprise is what she does next. Prepare yourself for a story of strength, family bonds, and a twist you won't soon forget. Settle in and enjoy. Our story is about to begin. Margaret Fletcher sat quietly in her living room, the old clock ticking away the seconds as she waited for her children to arrive. She had called them earlier that day, asking them to come over, but hadn't mentioned why. As she stared at the framed photographs lining the mantel, memories of a life filled with love and loss flooded her mind. She knew that what she was about to say would shake the foundation of their family. When Julie, Mark, and Stephen finally arrived, there was a sense of unease in the air. They exchanged puzzled glances, wondering what had prompted this sudden family meeting. Margaret motioned for them to sit down, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the edge of her chair. I need to tell you all something important," she began, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat.
I'm bankrupt.
"I've lost everything." For a moment, there was stunned silence. Then Julie, ever the practical one, leaned forward, her brow furrowed in concern. "What do you mean, everything? How could this happen?" Margaret sighed deeply. "After your father passed, I did my best to manage what he left behind, but the medical bills, the house, it all added up. I thought I could handle it, but I was wrong." Mark looked down at his hands, guilt washing over him. He had been so wrapped up in his own struggles that he hadn't noticed his mother's silent battle. Stephen, who had always distanced himself from the family's troubles, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact. Julie was the first to break the silence. "We'll figure this out, Mom. We'll find a way to help you. Maybe we can sell the house, downsize." But Margaret shook her head. "I've already made up my mind. I have a plan. And it doesn't involve selling the house or relying on anyone else." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, leaving her children more confused than ever. What could their mother possibly have in mind? As they exchanged uneasy glances, one thing was certain: Margaret Fletcher was not the frail old woman they had assumed her to be. The ride home was silent, each of Margaret's children lost in their own thoughts. Julie, usually so composed, couldn't stop her mind from racing. How had things gotten so bad without her noticing? She prided herself on being the one in control, the problem solver. But this was beyond anything she had anticipated. As soon as she got home, Julie called Mark and Stephen to discuss what they could do. "We need to make some decisions," she said, her voice firm. "Mom can't be left to manage this on her own." Mark, who had been dreading this conversation, sighed heavily. "I know, Jules. But what can we do? We don't have the money to bail her out." "We can start by getting her to move in with one of us," Julie suggested. "That house is too much for her to handle, and it's draining what little she has left." Stephen, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. "I don't think forcing her to move is the answer. She's still got her pride, you know? She won't take it well." "Then what do you suggest?" Julie snapped, her patience wearing thin. "Just let her keep struggling until she loses everything?" Stephen hesitated, unsure of how to respond. He knew his sister was right in many ways, but something about the whole situation didn't sit right with him. Their mother had always been a fighter, even if she hadn't shown it openly. The idea of her giving up and moving in with one of them seemed wrong. "I think we need to talk to her more," Stephen finally said. "Find out what this plan of hers is. Maybe she's got something up her sleeve." Julie rolled her eyes, frustrated by her brother's reluctance to take action. "And what if that plan is just wishful thinking? We can't afford to wait around and find out." Mark, sensing the tension rising, tried to calm things down. "Let's give her a few days. We'll go back and talk to her again, see if she'll open up about what she's planning. In the meantime, we should start looking into other options, just in case." Julie reluctantly agreed, though she wasn't happy about it. "Fine. But we need to be ready to step in, whatever her plan is. She's our mother, and we can't let her go through this alone." As they ended the call, each sibling was left with a lingering sense of unease. Margaret had always been the one to care for them, to make sure everything was all right. But now, the roles were reversed, and none of them knew quite how to handle it. Back at her house, Margaret was already several steps ahead. She knew her children were worried, and she understood why. But she also knew something they didn't. She had no intention of giving up. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of determination, a sense that she was capable of more than just surviving. She was ready to reclaim her life, no matter what it took. And she had a plan. Margaret spent the next few days in a whirlwind of activity, moving quietly and deliberately, keeping her plans under wraps. She knew her children meant well, but they didn't see the bigger picture. She wasn't looking for rescue, she was looking for renewal. There was an old notebook she had kept hidden in the back of her closet, filled with ideas and sketches from years ago. Margaret had always been fascinated by design, particularly handmade crafts. It had been a hobby once, but life had gotten in the way, and the pages had been long forgotten. Until now. Sitting at her kitchen table, Margaret flipped through the notebook, her fingers tracing the rough sketches of small, handcrafted items she had once dreamed of making. Jewelry, embroidered linens, decorative boxes. It was a small idea, nothing earth-shattering, but it was hers, and it was something she could do on her own terms. Determined, Margaret made a few calls to old acquaintances, people she had known from community events years ago. One of them, Mr. Walters, was an attorney who had helped her and her late husband with some legal matters in the past. He agreed to meet with her the next day to discuss setting up a small business, even if it was just a side project. The following afternoon, Margaret walked into Mr. Walters' office with her head held high. He smiled warmly as she entered, his face softening as he saw the familiar lines of determination in her eyes. "So, Margaret," he began, "you've always been full of surprises. What brings you here today?" She explained her plan. She wasn't looking for a quick fix, but something that would allow her to regain control of her life. A business of her own, however small, would be her lifeline. Walters listened carefully, nodding thoughtfully. "It's not easy starting over at this point in life, Margaret, but I've seen you push through tougher situations before. You've got a good idea here, and I think with the right approach, you can make this work. But it's going to take time. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret smiled, a glint of confidence in her eyes. "I've got nothing but time, Walter, and I'm not afraid of a little hard work." They discussed the details, from filing the necessary paperwork to registering a name for her business. Margaret left his office with a sense of accomplishment that had been missing for years. This was more than just a way to make money. It was a way to reclaim her independence. Back at home, her children continued their own discussions about her future. Julie, ever the practical one, had already researched several assisted living facilities, believing it was only a matter of time before Margaret would need them. Mark had visited the house a few times, offering help with the yard work, but Margaret had waved him off, insisting she had everything under control. Stephen, on the other hand, had been reflecting on their last conversation. Something about the way their mother had spoken stuck with him. She wasn't just trying to maintain appearances. She was planning something. And if Stephen had learned anything from watching her all these years, it was that when Margaret set her mind to something, there was no stopping her. One evening, while Margaret was working late in the dining room, Stephen showed up at her door unannounced. She was surprised to see him, but pleased. He was often the one who drifted in and out of her life, but when he was present, his company was always welcome. "I wanted to check on you," Stephen said, hesitating in the doorway. "Mind if I come in?" Margaret smiled. "Of course not. Come on in." As they sat together, the conversation drifted from small talk to more serious matters. Stephen finally asked the question that had been on his mind for days. "Mom, what's this plan you mentioned the other day? You've been acting like you've got something big up your sleeve." Margaret paused for a moment, then leaned back in her chair, the edges of her lips curling into a sly smile. "Well, Stephen, let's just say I've got a few tricks left in me." Her words piqued his curiosity, but Margaret wasn't ready to reveal everything just yet. She needed time to solidify her ideas before sharing them with anyone, even her own children. Stephen, sensing that she wasn't going to spill all her secrets just yet, decided to let it go for now. But there was something different about his mother, something stronger, more determined than he'd seen in years, and it only made him more curious about what was coming next. The sun was just beginning to set as Margaret sat by the window, watching the golden light filter through the trees. The day had been productive. She had met with a local supplier who agreed to provide her with the materials she needed at a discounted rate. Everything was slowly falling into place. Yet, there was an unease lingering in her chest, a weight that had settled since her conversation with Stephen. She knew it was only a matter of time before her children would demand to know the full extent of her plans. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the porch. Mark had arrived earlier than expected, with a determined look on his face. He entered the house without knocking, something Margaret had always appreciated about him. He was straightforward, just like his father. "Mom," Mark began, not wasting any time, "we need to talk. Julie's been on my case about this. And to be honest, I'm worried too. What exactly are you planning?" Margaret knew this moment was inevitable. She gestured for Mark to sit and took a deep breath, ready to lay her cards on the table. "I'm starting a business, Mark. A small one, but something that's mine. I'm going to make handcrafted items, jewelry, linens, things like that. It's not much, but it's something I've always wanted to do." Mark blinked, processing the information. "A business? Mom, well, that's a lot of work. And you know, you don't have to do this alone. We can help you." She cut him off, her voice firm but kind. "I know you want to help, and I appreciate that, but this is something I need to do on my own. I've spent too many years depending on others, and it's time I stood on my own 2 feet. "But why now?" Mark asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "Why not just let us take care of you? That's what we're here for." Margaret looked at him, her eyes softening. "Mark, I've spent my whole life taking care of others. Your father, you, Julie, Stephen, and I wouldn't trade that for anything. But I've lost a part of myself in the process. This isn't just about money. It's about finding that part of me again. I need to do this for me." Mark sat back, silent for a moment. He understood where she was coming from, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. "All right, Mom," he finally said. "If this is what you really want, then I'll support you. But promise me, if things get too hard, you'll let us step in." Margaret smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "I promise, Mark. But trust me, I've got more strength in me than you think." As Mark left, Margaret felt a sense of relief wash over her. She knew this was just the beginning of many difficult conversations, but having her son's support gave her the courage to keep moving forward. However, she couldn't ignore the tension that would surely arise once Julie found out about her plans. Margaret could already imagine the heated discussions that were likely to follow. Later that evening, Julie called, her voice tinged with irritation. "Mark just told me what you're up to, Mom. Starting a business? At your age? What are you thinking?" Margaret remained calm, prepared for this reaction. "I'm thinking that it's never too late to follow a dream, Julie. I've spent my life doing what was expected of me, and now I want to do something for myself." Julie sighed on the other end of the line. "But this is risky, Mom. What if it doesn't work out? What if you lose everything?" Margaret's tone softened, but her resolve was unwavering. "Julie, I know you're worried, and I love you for that. But I'm not afraid of failing. I'm more afraid of not trying at all." There was a long pause before Julie finally spoke again, her voice quieter now. "All right, Mom. I don't agree with this, but I won't stand in your way. Just be careful, okay?" "I will, dear. I promise," Margaret replied, a smile of determination on her lips. As the call ended, Margaret knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges, not just from the business itself, but from the people who loved her most. They were trying to protect her, but she was determined to show them that she was still capable of making her own way in the world. Margaret sat back, her eyes drifting to the notebook once again. This was her chance to prove that age was just a number, and that dreams, no matter how long they've been dormant, could still be pursued. Margaret awoke the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose. She had faced the doubts and concerns of her children head-on, and while she knew they still harbored reservations, their cautious support gave her the encouragement she needed. The small business she envisioned was starting to take shape, but as she prepared to dive deeper into her plans, the first real test of her resolve was about to unfold. She spent the morning organizing the supplies she had gathered, spreading them out on the dining room table. The once quiet and orderly space now buzzed with a newfound energy as she arranged fabrics, beads, and tools, each representing a piece of the dream she was determined to bring to life. Margaret knew that starting from scratch wouldn't be easy, but the thought of creating something with her own hands filled her with a sense of empowerment she hadn't felt in years. Just as she was settling into her work, the doorbell rang. Wiping her hands on her apron, Margaret went to answer it, surprised to find Julie standing on the porch, her expression serious. "Julie, what a surprise!" Margaret greeted her, stepping aside to let her in.
Come in.
Julie entered, glancing around at the supplies covering the dining room table. "Looks like you're really going through with this," she remarked, her tone neutral. Margaret nodded, a small smile on her lips. "I am. I've got everything I need to get started. It's going to take some time, but I'm ready." Julie hesitated, then turned to face her mother. "I came because I wanted to talk to you about something. I've been doing some thinking, and some research." Margaret's smile faltered slightly, sensing where this conversation might be headed. "What kind of research?" Julie sighed, clearly conflicted. "Mom, I know you want to do this on your own, but I just can't sit by and watch you struggle. I've been looking into some legal options, ways to protect you in case things don't go as planned. Margaret's eyes narrowed, a hint of frustration creeping into her voice. Julie, I appreciate your concern, but I don't need protection. I need to stand on my own 2 feet. I understand that, I really do, Julie replied, trying to remain calm. But what if something happens? What if you lose everything? I just want to make sure you're safe. Margaret's resolve hardened. Julie, I've already made my decision. I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do it my way. I don't need legal safeguards or a safety net. What I need is for you to trust me. Julie's expression softened, the tension between them palpable. I do trust you, Mom, but I'm scared. I don't want to see you get hurt. Margaret took a deep breath, reaching out to place a hand on her daughter's arm. Julie, I've spent my whole life taking care of others, of you and your brothers. Now it's time for me to take care of myself. I know this is hard for you to understand, but I need you to let me try. Julie's shoulders slumped in defeat. She knew there was no changing her mother's mind, but the worry in her heart refused to subside. All right, Mom, I'll back off. But if you ever need anything at all, you call me, okay? Margaret nodded, her eyes softening. I will, dear. I promise. As Julie left, Margaret felt a mixture of relief and sadness. She knew her daughter's concerns came from a place of love, but she couldn't let that deter her. This was her chance to reclaim her life, and she wasn't about to let fear, even if it was her daughter's, hold her back. That evening, as Margaret settled back into her work, the phone rang. It was Stephen, calling to check in. They spoke about her day, and as they talked, Margaret found herself sharing more about her plans than she had with anyone else. Stephen listened intently, offering encouragement without judgment, which was exactly what she needed. But just as Margaret began to feel a sense of peace, a letter arrived the next day that threatened to derail everything. It was from the bank, a stark reminder of the precarious financial situation she was in. The tone of the letter was cold and unforgiving, outlining the steps they would take if she didn't meet her next payment on the house. Panic gripped her for the first time in weeks, and she realized just how fragile her plan truly was. The resolve Margaret had felt so strongly began to waver. Doubts she had kept at bay now flooded her mind. Could she really do this? Was it too late to turn back? But then she remembered the conversations she had with her children, especially with Stephen, and the commitment she had made to herself. She couldn't let fear win. Margaret knew she had to push through this, not just for her own sake, but to prove to herself and her children that she was still capable of overcoming whatever life threw her way. With renewed determination, Margaret decided to take a bold step. She would go to the bank herself and negotiate, face to face, something she hadn't done in years. It was time to confront the reality of her situation head-on and find a way to make her dream a reality, no matter what it took. Margaret stepped into the bank, the familiar sterile environment making her feel small and out of place. The cold, impersonal air conditioning hummed overhead, contrasting sharply with the warmth of the late summer day outside. As she approached the front desk, a young teller glanced up at her, offering a polite, if somewhat distracted, smile. "Hello, how can I help you today?" the teller asked. Margaret cleared her throat, summoning the courage that had carried her through so much already. "I need to speak with someone about my mortgage. It's urgent." The teller nodded and directed her to an office at the back of the building. Margaret's steps felt heavier with each stride, but she pushed forward, reminding herself of why she was there. She was not going to let this setback stop her. This was just another challenge to overcome. Inside the office, a man in his late 40s, with thinning hair and a crisp suit, sat behind a large mahogany desk. His nameplate read, Mr. Collins. He looked up as Margaret entered, offering a professional smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mrs. Fletcher, please have a seat," he said, motioning to the chair across from him. Margaret sat down, clasping her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. She explained her situation, the financial difficulties, her new business venture, and her need for more time to get everything in order. Mr. Collins listened, nodding occasionally, but his expression remained unreadable. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "Mrs. Fletcher, I understand your position, but the bank has policies in place that we have to follow. We've already extended the deadline twice, and there's only so much flexibility we can offer." Margaret felt a pang of fear in her chest, but she refused to let it show. "I understand, Mr. Collins, but I'm asking for just a little more time. I'm starting a business, and I believe it will generate enough income to cover the payments. I just need a few more months to get on my feet." Mr. Collins sighed, tapping his fingers on the desk. "A few more months? That's not a small request, Mrs. Fletcher. I'll have to discuss this with my superiors." Margaret leaned forward, her voice steady. "I've been a loyal customer for years. My husband and I took out our first mortgage with this bank over 40 years ago. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a chance to keep the home we built together." Mr. Collins's expression softened slightly, and he nodded. "I'll see what I can do, Mrs. Fletcher. It might take a few days to get an answer, but I'll do my best to advocate for you." Margaret thanked him, her heart still racing as she left the office. The encounter had been nerve-wracking, but she had done what she needed to do. Now, all she could do was wait and hope that the bank would show her the mercy she so desperately needed. As she stepped back outside, the warmth of the sun felt like a small comfort. Margaret took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had faced one of her greatest fears, and while the outcome was still uncertain, she felt a sense of pride for having taken control of her situation. Later that evening, as she returned home, Margaret found herself restless, unable to focus on her work. The uncertainty of the bank's decision weighed heavily on her, and she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in her stomach. She was beginning to question whether she had the strength to see this through. Just as Margaret was about to retire for the night, the phone rang. She hesitated before answering, half expecting it to be one of her children checking in on her again. But to her surprise, it was Mr. Walters, the attorney she had consulted earlier. "Margaret," he began, his tone calm but urgent, "I've been thinking about your situation, and I believe there's another option you might consider. It's a bit unconventional, but it could give you the breathing room you need." Margaret listened intently as Mr. Walters explained his idea. He suggested that she could leverage a portion of the equity in her home to secure a short-term loan, enough to cover the immediate payments and give her the time she needed to get her business off the ground. It wasn't without risk, but it was a possibility. She thanked him and hung up, her mind racing. The idea of taking on more debt was daunting, but it might be the only way to buy herself the time she so desperately needed. The decision weighed heavily on her, and she knew it was one she couldn't make lightly. That night, as Margaret lay in bed, she found herself staring at the ceiling, her thoughts a whirl of possibilities and uncertainties. The fear of losing her home, the place where she had built her life with her late husband, was almost unbearable. But the thought of giving up on her dream, of not fighting for the future she wanted, was even worse. With a deep breath, Margaret made her decision. She would go back to Mr. Walters and take the risk. It was a gamble, but it was one she was willing to make. She had come too far to turn back now. As she drifted off to sleep, Margaret felt a newfound resolve settle over her. No matter what happened, she was determined to see this through. She would fight for her home, for her business, and for the life she wanted to create. And she wouldn't let anything, or anyone, stand in her way. Margaret woke up the next morning with a sense of determination. The decision she made the night before had solidified in her mind, and she knew what needed to be done. After a quick breakfast, she called Mr. Walters to confirm her decision. He agreed to meet her that afternoon to go over the details and start the paperwork. At the meeting, Mr. Walters was straightforward. "This loan will give you the breathing room you need, but it also comes with its risks, Margaret. You'll have to work hard to make those payments on time. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Margaret nodded, her expression resolute. "I've never been more certain of anything. I'm ready to fight for what's mine." The paperwork was signed, and with that, Margaret secured the loan. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it gave her the time she needed to get her business off the ground. She felt a sense of relief, knowing that she had a plan in place. Back at home, Margaret wasted no time. She dove into her work, creating prototypes of the products she planned to sell. She reached out to local markets and online platforms, setting up small sales channels to test the waters. Each day was a whirlwind of activity, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt truly alive. As the days turned into weeks, Margaret's hard work began to pay off. Orders started trickling in, and the small business she had dreamed of was slowly becoming a reality. She knew there was still a long way to go, but every small success felt like a victory. One evening, as Margaret was packaging up an order, Stephen called. "Hey, Mom. I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. You sound busy." Margaret smiled, the pride evident in her voice. "I am, Stephen. The business is starting to pick up. It's not much yet, but it's something." Stephen paused for a moment. "I'm really proud of you, Mom. I know this hasn't been easy, but you've proven you can do it." His words meant the world to Margaret. She had faced so many doubts, both from herself and others, but hearing her son's support filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. As she hung up the phone, Margaret allowed herself a moment to reflect. She had taken a risk, and it was beginning to pay off. But she knew she couldn't get complacent. There was still much to be done, and the challenges were far from over. Yet, as Margaret looked around at the work she had accomplished, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. Margaret had been riding the wave of small successes, but deep down, she knew the real test was still ahead. As her business grew, so did the pressures. Orders were coming in faster than she could keep up, and the fear of falling behind gnawed at her. The loan she had taken out loomed over her like a shadow, a constant reminder that failure was not an option. One afternoon, as Margaret was working on a particularly large order, the phone rang. It was Julie, and from the tone of her voice, Margaret knew this wasn't just a casual check-in. "Mom, we need to talk," Julie began, not bothering with pleasantries. "I've been looking over your finances, and I'm worried. This loan you took out, it's risky. If you can't keep up with the payments, you could lose everything." Margaret sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. She had expected this conversation eventually. "Julie, I appreciate your concern, but I'm managing. The business is growing, and I'm keeping up with the payments." Julie's voice softened, but the concern was still there. "I know you're doing your best, Mom, but I'm scared you're putting too much on yourself. What if something goes wrong? You're taking on so much." Margaret felt a pang of frustration. "Julie, I understand the risks, but I'm not going to let fear stop me. I've come too far to back down now. I need you to trust me on this." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Julie spoke, her voice laced with resignation. "All right, Mom. I won't push it anymore. Just, please be careful." "I will, dear," Margaret replied, trying to keep the conversation light. But after they hung up, Julie's words lingered in her mind. That night, as Margaret lay in bed, the weight of everything began to press down on her. The fear that Julie had voiced was one she had been trying to suppress for weeks. What if she couldn't keep up? What if she failed? But then, she remembered why she had started this journey in the first place. This wasn't just about money. It was about reclaiming her life, proving to herself and her children that she was still capable of standing on her own 2 feet. With that thought, Margaret felt a renewed sense of determination. She couldn't afford to let doubt creep in now. She had to keep moving forward, one step at a time. The next morning, Margaret received a letter from a local boutique she had contacted weeks ago. They were interested in carrying her products in their store, and they wanted to meet to discuss the details. It was the break she had been hoping for, a chance to expand her reach and grow her business even further. As she prepared for the meeting, Margaret felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. This was a big opportunity, but it also meant more work, more pressure. Yet, as she looked around at what she had already accomplished, Margaret knew she was ready. She had come too far to turn back now. Margaret arrived at the boutique early, her heart pounding with anticipation. The small shop, nestled in the heart of the town's historic district, had a cozy, welcoming vibe. It was the kind of place she could picture her products fitting right in. As she entered, the owner, a stylish woman in her 50s named Claire, greeted her with a warm smile. "Margaret, it's so nice to finally meet you in person," Claire said, extending her hand. "I've been impressed with the samples you sent over. They're exactly the kind of unique, handcrafted items our customers love." Margaret felt a surge of pride. "Thank you, Claire. I've put my heart into these pieces, and I'm thrilled that you think they'd be a good fit for your store." They spent the next hour discussing the details, pricing, quantities, and display options. Margaret felt a mix of excitement and nerves as they finalized the agreement. This was a big step for her business, one that could take her to the next level, but it also meant more responsibility, more work, and more pressure to succeed. As Margaret was about to leave, Claire stopped her. "There's one more thing, Margaret. I've been thinking about doing a special event to introduce your products, a sort of launch party. It could be a great way to generate buzz and get people excited about your brand. What do you think?" Margaret's mind raced. A launch party was more than she had ever imagined, but it was also an opportunity she couldn't pass up. "That sounds wonderful, Claire. I'd be honored." With the arrangements made, Margaret left the boutique, her mind buzzing with ideas for the event. But as she walked back to her car, reality began to set in. This was a huge opportunity, but it was also a huge risk. If the launch didn't go well, it could set her back significantly. Back at home, Margaret threw herself into preparations. She worked late into the night, crafting new items, perfecting designs, and planning every detail of the event. The pressure was intense, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time in years, she felt truly alive, driven by a purpose that was entirely her own. As the day of the launch approached, Margaret's nerves began to fray. Julie called frequently, offering to help, but Margaret insisted on doing everything herself. This was her moment, and she wanted to prove, to herself and to her children, that she could handle it. The night before the event, Stephen dropped by unexpectedly. "Mom, I've been thinking. I know you've got everything under control, but are you sure you don't want a hand with this? I'm not as good with crafts as you, but I can help with the setup, at least." Margaret smiled, touched by his offer. "I appreciate it, Stephen, but I need to do this on my own. It's important to me." Stephen nodded, understanding. "All right, but I'll be there tomorrow. I wouldn't miss it for the world." The next day, the boutique was abuzz with activity. The event was a success from the start, with people admiring Margaret's work and making purchases. Claire was thrilled, and Margaret couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as she watched customers pick up her items, appreciating the care and craftsmanship that went into each piece. Julie and Mark arrived together, their faces lighting up when they saw how well everything was going. "Mom, this is amazing!" Julie exclaimed, hugging her tightly. "I knew you could do it." Mark nodded in agreement. "You've outdone yourself, Mom. This is just the beginning. I can feel it." As the evening wound down and the last customer left, Margaret stood in the middle of the boutique, taking it all in. She had done it. She had taken the risk, faced her fears, and succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. But as she looked around, she realized something else. This wasn't just about proving herself. It was about rediscovering who she was and reclaiming a part of herself that had been lost for too long. And in that moment, Margaret knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she was ready. She had found her strength, and she wasn't going to let anything or anyone take it away from her again. The days following the launch event were a blur of activity. Orders poured in from the boutique, and Margaret found herself busier than ever. But this time, the work didn't feel overwhelming. It felt fulfilling. The success of the event had given her a new sense of confidence, and she approached each day with a determination that surprised even her. However, the challenges were far from over. One afternoon, as Margaret was finalizing an order, the phone rang. It was Mr. Collins from the bank. His tone was polite but serious. "Mrs. Fletcher, I wanted to update you on your loan. We've been reviewing your payments, and while you've been consistent, the deadline for the final repayment is approaching. I'm afraid there isn't much flexibility left." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She had been so focused on her business that the looming deadline had slipped to the back of her mind. "I understand, Mr. Collins. I'll make sure the payment is made on time." After hanging up, Margaret sat in silence, the weight of her situation pressing down on her. The success of her business was undeniable, but it wasn't enough to cover the final payment on the loan. She needed a miracle, and she needed it fast. That evening, Margaret gathered her children at the house. She had been open with them about everything so far, and now was no time to hide the truth. As they sat around the living room, she explained the situation, her voice calm but serious. "I've done everything I can, but the final payment is more than I can cover with what I have right now," Margaret admitted. "I need to figure out a way to come up with the money, and I'm running out of time." Julie, always the planner, immediately began brainstorming solutions. "We could sell off some assets, maybe the car or some of the antiques. It might not cover everything, but it could help." Mark nodded. "And I could lend you some money, Mom. I don't have much, but I've been saving a bit. It might make a difference." Stephen, who had been quiet, finally spoke up. "What about the boutique? The launch was a hit. Maybe you could negotiate an advance on the next round of orders." Margaret appreciated their suggestions, but she knew they were only temporary fixes. The truth was, she needed a long-term solution, not just a quick patch. But before she could respond, the doorbell rang. To their surprise, it was Claire from the boutique, standing on the porch with an envelope in her hand. "Margaret, I'm sorry to drop by unannounced, but I have something for you." Inside the envelope was a check, much larger than Margaret had ever expected. Claire explained, "After the event, several customers placed bulk orders for your products. They were so impressed with your work that they wanted to secure their purchases in advance. This check covers those orders, and there's more to come." Margaret stared at the check, tears welling up in her eyes. It was exactly what she needed to cover the final payment. "Claire, I don't know what to say. This is a lifesaver." Claire smiled warmly. "You earned it, Margaret. Your work is extraordinary, and people are starting to notice. This is just the beginning." As Claire left, Margaret looked at her children, the relief evident on her face. "It looks like we're going to make it after all." Julie, Mark, and Stephen all smiled, their expressions a mix of pride and admiration. Margaret had done it. Against all odds, she had pulled through. And in doing so, she had not only secured her financial future, but also proven to herself and her family that she was still capable of great things. As they sat together, talking and laughing, Margaret realized that this journey had been about more than just survival. It had been about rediscovering her strength, her independence, and her passion. And now, with the support of her family and the success of her business, she knew that the future was bright. Margaret had reclaimed her life, and she wasn't about to let go of it any time soon. The challenges might keep coming, but she was ready for them, because now she knew that no matter what, she could handle whatever life threw her way. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment with a number from 1 to 5 to let us know how much you like the story. Also watch the video that is currently on your screen. See you soon.